we all know the term real world data. I think it's all around us at the moment, but what does this mean in the context of early access programs? Famida, this is very much your area of expertise. In the rare disease space, why is real world data capture from an EAP so important? What is the potential value that that data brings?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I think it's already been covered a little bit by what John put up on one of the slides, that when we think about clinical trials, we have, a very strict methodology that we have to follow, very high internal validity, essentially a more homogeneous population with tight criteria. In EAP programs and in real world data, you're really looking at higher external validity, because we all know that in real life, a drug that's approved, even if it is in a particular group or cohort, is going to be used in patients who don't necessarily fit the eligibility criteria for a trial. So the way that I like to think about real world data, and again, this has been said a little bit, that it also gives us an opportunity to understand effectiveness as opposed to efficacy, and also safety and outcomes. When patients register for a clinical trial, we like to actually get a consent from them for a registry or real world data registry at the time that they're either deemed to be eligible or not eligible for a trial. And what that means is that essentially you can be running real world data alongside a trial without interfering with the pivotal process for the trial, not in the patients who are in the trial, but for patients who didn't make the screen into the trial. And why is this important? Because what we see is a scramble often where at the very end, you're trying to collect data retrospectively, when the reality is that prospectively you can gain a lot more knowledge that will help you once the drug is approved. And because you're already consenting patients who are going into the trial, when the trial is over and the pivotal data are submitted, you can then go back to those patients who consented and were in the trial, and you don't have to go back and try to reconsent them. So really looking at how do we actually, look at this expanded criteria, evaluate populations who may not have been part of the initial study. And then from a company perspective, when we think about our stakeholders, I think the value is really significant, because if you get a drug approved, it doesn't mean anybody's going to pay for it. I think we all know that. And so the EAP program becomes very attractive as a mechanism to actually get a product into people's hands and to collect information about how patients do, including their quality of life data, not just restricted to the clinical and biomarker data. So it's very important because, based on what I've said, but also I'll give you a quick example. I remember I was in India in October 2019, and I had the opportunity to visit the Indian Orphan Rare Disease Group in Bangalore. And it was striking to me that when Spinoza or SMA was being studied, the Indian population, who have actually over 1 million patients with rare disease, which obviously makes sense because they're so huge, almost nobody had access to the trial. And that's just because the numbers weren't, in favor in terms of being able to recruit globally. And so I think we often forget that EAPs can also bring us a breadth of knowledge and information, but help patients in countries who don't otherwise have access to medication. And that's also important to think about, because we focus a lot on the Western Hemisphere, but being able to touch people in other hemispheres is equally important. And that's where an EAP also, I think, helps pharmaceutical companies really understand how a drug will do in other jurisdictions, which essentially can also help them as they think about future marketing and targeting.
Thank you, Famida. And I think that's really important, looking at the picture in other regions, which we're going to touch on a little bit later. So what are the critical things that companies need to get right when capturing real world data in an EAP?
Yeah, so I would say that some of the most important things are to actually know what you're asking. I like to ask what our hypothesis is before you try to collect information. And the analogy I use is, imagine if you went to a grocery store and I gave you a basket and you popped every single ingredient you could find on the shelf because you just wanted everything. And let's say it was Smarties and Mars and things like that people like to eat, but you're not necessarily going to be able to make anything out of everything you put in your basket. So think carefully about what you're putting in your basket, know the questions that you need to be able to answer, and take a very pragmatic and think approach, thinking about a minimal data set. we all have a tendency to want to collect a lot, but a lot doesn't necessarily bring benefit, right? You want to think about, what is the regulator going to want? What is it that we need to find out from patients in terms of their experience and their lived experience with a particular condition, as well as how the drug is affecting them, again, also from their preferences and quality of life perspective. And for us, it's also important to make sure that the data are mapped to a regulatory standard. So we've been pushing really hard. I mean, you know that FDA came out with some guidance last year. We responded to that, but I've also been pushing Health Canada to adopt a standard. So structured data to OMOP, which is an ontology that can be transformed into regulatory grade data. And that is really important because how you collect it, et cetera, is also important. It has to be usable. And then finally, from a company perspective, from a pharmaceutical company perspective, I think that, you know, they need to remember that they're taking on a huge responsibility. If you get this wrong, there's potentially harm, right? And I don't mean harm in terms of harming a person intentionally. When we're designing clinical trials, we're always looking at the number needed to treat and the number needed to harm. The number needed to harm in an EAP is if you mess it up, that means that you're not going to get approval. That's the harm. And so also remembering, and I think this has been mentioned a little bit, that EAPs in every country are different. And I think Professor Das also said, you can't compel people to collect information. So another key thing is we need to understand the clinician workflow. What is it that they do when they see a patient? Not every disease is the same. You've got to think about, you know, what are the data that need to be collected based on the workflow in that particular group. A cardiologist and an oncologist are not looking at the same thing at the same time. So the easier we make it and make sure that, you know, we're not burdening people collecting data in a way that is not pragmatic is an important consideration for success.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And John, if I come to you, I'm interested to know, based on your experience, obviously with working with companies to deliver EAPs, what are the other things that you think should be highlighted relating to real world data capture?
One thing I just want to highlight, what Famida mentioned, you know, that sometimes we're talking with pharmaceutical companies, and depending on who's in the room, they're thinking, oh, if we could get this, that, this, you know, all this information, and we really have to pull them back to say, you know, we have to be reasonable here. You have to realize this is a, you know, a treatment mechanism as opposed to a clinical trial. If you want to do, you know, all that information, you should really think about running a clinical trial. So it's really trying to get the right balance. To Professor Das's point, it's, you know, the clinicians are very busy. They and their staff are seeing patients all the time. You just have to be careful about what you're asking. And oftentimes when we're speaking with our pharma partners who are interested in capturing data, we're suggesting that they talk to their key investigators in their trial and saying, you know, if we had an EAP where we want to capture real world data, you know, what data should we be capturing? What's the benefit? And really thinking about that. And we'd also encourage companies to talk to, you know, their patient advocacy groups in that setting as well, because I think, again, trying to understand, you know, and I think, you know, patients are very willing to provide information, especially in the rare disease space. But I think it's good getting that input from the different stakeholders. Famida mentioned it and referenced it too. I think, you know, generally you can ask, but you can't obligate clinicians to provide this data. So just realize that. And getting back to the point about being busy in some you know, countries, you can offer a small stipend to cover the time for the cost for the physician to capture that information. And so that's certainly something worth doing, realizing that you're getting you know, benefit from that. Another strategy that we've used too is, you know, if for clinicians willing to participate in the EAP and in providing real world data, being part of a publication coming out of that. So again, there's some other strategies that companies can use to help, I don't want to say incentivize, but to encourage clinicians to participate. But just be careful about, you know, getting the balance right, realizing that everybody's got a lot going on. And while the data it could be extremely valuable, you just have to be thoughtful about how you do that.
Sure. Oh, great. Thank you, John. And in terms of partnering with patient groups, Famida, obviously you work incredibly closely with patient groups in the work that you do. How important is that partnering into the success of the data collection?
It's very important, Nicola, because even though an EAP is not a substitute for a clinical trial, there are a lot of things that patients experience that we never really know about.
Yeah.
And I was smiling a little bit when I was hearing some of the conversation that Dave and Roberta were having, because 25 years ago, when we were doing quality of life research, everybody thought that quality of life was something that was ridiculous and was something soft. And look at where we are today, health-related quality of life, patient preferences. And we look at, particularly in rare disease, it's not static, right? A disease changes over time. And you look at some of the failures that we've seen in treatments, it's because we haven't really understood the natural history in some cases, and sometimes it just something doesn't work. So I think that working with patient organizations is really important. And I'm going to give one example. So we've built the CDKL5 registry, and Don will be familiar with this because I think Ultragenics is part of that. When we started building that, there had been a couple of failures where a different organization had actually recruited patients, and there were 15 patients recruited. 10 of those patients were not accepted by the FDA. So that's a failed study. No company was willing to work with one another because there's an element of competitiveness. But today, because of the work that not just we've been doing, but working with the CDKL5 groups, in particular the Lulu Foundation, who we work with closely in UPenn, we were able to bring different pharmaceutical companies together. And they're currently engaged in an endpoint study. And why am I raising this now? Because the question you asked about working with patient organizations, there are multiple organizations and they don't always see eye to eye. And so being able to understand what's important to each of those organizations also comes into play, because you see this in every single disease. I'm sure, Nicola, you've seen it in some of the conditions that you're familiar with. Yeah. And patient advocacy groups have enormous impact on patients who have a condition. On the positive side too, they can advise on the data collected and whether it truly reflects the disease. So we have, as scientists, we have a hypothetical view or a view based on what we know from science and what's been published. It isn't until you sit down and you talk to a patient where they tell you what's important to them is not, being able to meet a 6-minute test or, a gait test. It's being able to get out of a chair and take a couple of steps or feed themselves. And so when we were building the CDKL5 data dictionary, we actually sat down with patients first before we sat down with clinicians, and then validated the data to make sure that whatever we were collecting was measurable, most importantly. And then finally, as we expanded this program, we also had to understand in different regions, things are collected in different ways. And we needed to engage with national advocates, not just global groups. So even in CDKL5, there's a global umbrella, but each country has their own group. And they think about things very differently. And we can't lose sight of that, where you're looking at, many drugs now that will hopefully be coming to market.
And did you want to add something to that, Dave?
Yeah, I just spoke with the leader of a patient organization for ultra rare disease, and what she told me was, she said, I'm not just a biomarker. That my symptoms are so important, and sometimes they're not captured correctly. And so really saying what Famita is, that it's important to really have that dialogue so that you are capturing what it is that the patients themselves value in regards to a treatment or seeing their disease maybe not progress and things like that.
And I think, sorry.
No, when you go, Famita.
Yes, can I add to that? We have had situations where what was seen in the clinical setting was completely different than how the families through their daily life, all day, all night, have felt. And we have been able to open up the door with the companies to offer creative ways to collect data directly from patients so they can correlate that and further refine and align the data that they see and explain why there are differences, what those differences are, how patients see those differences. And it has been instrumental to the progress of an EAP and really connecting the dots on what's happening in the clinical setting versus at home. And so to Famita's point, real world data collection is important on both sides.
Yeah. And it was interesting what you said, Famida, about working with multiple patient organizations, which is really important because, you know, where there are multiple ones, patients will gravitate towards the one that aligns with their way of thinking, their lifestyle, their philosophy. So by making sure that you're working with all of them, you know, like you say, they don't always get on, but making sure you're working with all of them, you're capturing a really balanced view of the patient population, not just those that might align with a particular stance. So that's really interesting that you're doing that work to work across them all.
Yeah, and the only other thing I was going to add, Nicola, is that, you know, what we've also done is patients want to contribute data. They're looking for a cure. That's the motivation. And it's a big drain on a patient. We talked about the drain on the clinical system or on clinicians, but a patient doesn't have time to enter the same data into 4 different portals for 4 different organizations. And at the end of the day, you know, what we found is that if we have a consent from a patient, that then if somebody else wants to do research, another organization, we've done memorandum of understanding where if the patient consents, we will share, obviously using a tokenized system and a global unique identification number for GDPR compliance. Those data can be shared in a de-identified way with another researcher. And so the burden is no longer on the patient. And, you know, they don't feel like they're letting anybody down. Everybody can work collaboratively. At the end of the day, this is about moving, you know, science forward. And when you look at even also, I think a good point was made here about lived experience, Roberta. There are a lot of instruments that don't exist. And so that's the other thing you find out. You know, in CDKL5, a new instrument was built because what is being used in many of these conditions doesn't actually have anything that measures the true impact of the disease. And so that's also a unique opportunity when you're working with patient advocacy groups to find out that the way we're collecting data that the regulators currently use, by the way, doesn't actually give you any signal. Yeah. Because many of these instruments were developed for more generic use. And also in some of the rare conditions, rare oncology as an example, they were developed at a time when chemotherapy was being used, you know, 30 years ago, not today where people are using IO and targeted treatment. So you're not measuring anything. And so I think the regulators need to kind of think about that too.
Yeah, evolution, absolutely vital.